Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. So we're just going to go through this interesting talk. My name's Adam Kane. I'm Sustainability Lead for ACO Technologies in the UK. Today I'm joined by Craig Jones, who is the founder of Circular Ecology, and they are a key partner of ACO in the measurement and management of complex carbon data. And I really wanted to start the presentation by kind of outlining that for every molecule of carbon there is in the construction industry, fundamentally there's a company behind it, and those companies have to act in a corporately responsible way and a socially responsible way. So it's not just about decarbonising, it's also about how we behave and how we act. So in the first part of this journey or this presentation, I just want to take you through how ACO have been acting or trying to act in a responsible way. You be the judge. And see and show you where we're going in terms of our carbon journey, our carbon measurement, and where we plan on going in the future, and what our ambition is as we align with different standards. Next slide, please. Sorry. It's always the technology, isn't it? Oh, shit. Right, cool. So really just going to start by looking at our journey. So fundamentally our DNA at ACO is evolving as we transition. We've had the appointment of a new managing director, which has really renewed our focus in the sustainability arena. I was appointed as a sustainability lead about 4 years ago now. And the idea behind that was I was appointed to make sure we focus solely on sustainability as a subject to decarbonise our business. And I chair the internal structures, so I chair the sustainability strategy and implementation team at ACO, where we bring together all of the core team members or heads of the company from across the business. Alongside that, we've changed the way that we do reporting, so we focus not so much on we focus on carbon reporting for government, but we also focus on the ESG reporting or environmental social governance reporting. And that really aligns with us of how what we're doing with our commitment to the UN Global Compact more recently, and also the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where we've had our near-term targets approved. Right, listen back. Brilliant. So we've taken a multidisciplinary approach or multifaceted approach really. And it's not just about carbon. What you see on the screen here is our carbon targets and our strategy towards decarbonisation. But it's also about the social side of it and social sustainability and what we're doing in that arena. And the idea is the reason why I want to focus on this and try and broadcast it to the audience is that in reducing carbon, it's got to be a just transition. And I'm sure that you'll all be aware of this in the room, so I won't labour it too much. So it's really about how we not only measure ourselves, but how we're measured in industry and how we align with critical, the UN Global Compact and things of that nature. So we're compliant with global initiatives like human rights, labour, environment and anti-corruption. And those are really core pillars that we need to structure the industry on. So it's not just focusing on decarbonising, it's also how we take people along with us. And we've achieved some great numbers in the last few years. I'm not saying it's solely by the action I've taken, it's a whole company that it takes to do these things. So what you'll see on the screen here is the SBTi figures. In all honesty, I was quite shocked by what we've achieved, so I should have set them a lot higher. But in the last few years, we've procured 100% renewable energy, renewable gas, we're looking towards solar panels and things of that nature. But we've had a quite dramatic decrease in our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and since 2015 we've had a 70% decrease. So it's quite substantial numbers in our Scope 1 and 2, and we've also reduced our Scope 3, though that's more to do with market-driven forces and things of that nature. But what you can see is that we've done for our different scopes, but we're also doing it for the carbon embedded in the products, which are listed in the text on the right-hand side of this slide. So it's not just about we're doing it for our operations, we're also doing it embedded in the actual products themselves and taking further action. We've also released a carbon smart product, which is a carbon neutral Qmax essentially, where we've reduced the embedded carbon as much as we can, and then we offset the rest. I know there's a fair bit of bad press around offsetting, but we need to evolve the way we tackle these things, so we can only decarbonize so much, and we have to mitigate the extended impacts associated with the products themselves. So now we're really going to focus on the carbon measurement and what our customers want. So really delving into the subject. So the driving force behind any company to act and decarbonize and take action is twofold essentially. It's about being a socially conscionable and a conscientious company in the first principles that drive down through the core of the business. And there's also the second driving force is the customer, you at the other end, and what you require of us. And as a company, we get a lot of requests for information, whether it be our emissions data, whether it be embedded carbon, whether it be environmental social impacts, and then we have to provide them in a litany of different ways. And it's quite a complex field for us to mitigate as a manufacturer and trying to weave our way through to make sure that we're compliant and giving you what you need. And the landscape for compliance is becoming increasingly more complex. So every year there's another one added and so on and so forth. What you see here is not a definitive list, but these are just some of the requirements that have come into us as a business and how we have to actually output the data to provide it to you. And this will all become clear of why I'm actually explaining this. So they range in requirements from CBAM, when we've actually got import to the European Union, the tax is being implemented there over the next few years, all the way through to the London Plan, and also various sustainability certification schemes such as BREEAM, as you can see on the screen. And before compliance comes essentially the complexity of data collection. Now, ACO are quite a big company in the UK in terms of one of the leaders in the market in terms of channel drainage systems. But you can see that when you look at it even from my point of view, when I'm actually looking at a number of products and everything we have to delve and provide data for, we're a UK company, we've got 2 manufacturing plants, but then within those plants, within our supply network, we've got like 12,000 products, and that's quite a substantial number. They're made up of 76 different materials in various different combinations, so we have to understand the embedded carbon associated with all of them. And of course, there's different manufacturing processes each one of those products has to go for to be constructed, and all coming from different suppliers. It's a litany, and because we've diversified our supply chain so much in the way that we procure materials, then we're having to unweave that in order to actually find ways to measure the embedded carbon from each different location, different sites, and also the companies that we procure them from in themselves. So if you start that process is in all the energy and everything like that we have to deal with in terms of how we measure it and we collect it from the supply chain. So that could be anything from platforms, where we use ESG platforms for their compliance data, or we use Excel sheets where we actually go out into the marketplace and we collect the data manually and then try to decipher it. But from that, we have to create a profile for the supplier. We have to have our own profile in terms of the energy that we're creating and using. And then we have to basically assemble that data and quality assure it before we can either use companies like Circular Ecology, where they can actually calculate the embedded carbon of the materials themselves, and then eventually that leads to EPDs and the outputs in terms of calculation softwares, carbon reports, or whether it be the published EPDs at the end of the process. And of course, the dreaded one of Scope 3 and decarbonising in line with our Science-Based Targets initiative. And of course, the outputs, but the output from it in terms of depending on the measurement and how we've actually utilised that, then goes into your compliance objectives and how you can use that data. So, a bit of a messy picture there, I apologise for that. I don't know how small it is for people at the back of the screen. But the idea is I was trying to highlight the complexity and the nuances behind we create all this data, all this output, and then how you use it as individuals. And it creates a complex picture that we have to unravel and make sure we're targeting the specific products, because you could pick one of 12,000. So, So our commitment to the measurement has already borne some fruit. So we've working with our partners. We've measured 900 of the 12,000 products so far, and we keep on expanding that every single year. So it feels like a bit of a drop in the ocean when you're looking at the pure numbers, but we're making progress. And it goes a bit further than that. So we started our carbon reporting back in 2015 when we started developing reports. That gave us a baseline and an understanding of, as we evolved and as we changed our procurement, changed our supply chain processes. Then in 2022, we understood where we stood in terms of decarbonisation in those materials. And of course, moving forward from that, our parent companies developed EPDs, and then we've got, in the future, we're having online softwares that we're creating. They're going to make it easier to access. And the last slide I've got is really just a focus on setting our sights on the future. And what we really want is a robust EPD for every single product we do, but obviously that's going to take time. And therefore, we want to make sure that you have access to the actual data when you want it and where you want it, which is a critical milestone as we move forward towards EPDs. And I want to now hand you over to Craig Jones, of Circular Ecology, and I hope your presentation comes up. There's your...
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. I'm Craig Jones. I work at Circular Ecology, and we're specialist consultants, embodied carbon consultants, carbon footprinting, life cycle assessment. So we've been working with ACO since about 2015. I think they've done some great work on helping to measure and manage their carbon emissions, which has been shown well by Adam's slides. We particularly help put the data and tools in place to help look at those carbon reductions. So in this case study, I'm going to give a bit of an overview. So now companies are increasingly expected to measure their carbon emissions. And carbon emissions can primarily be calculated for an organization, of which many companies are now calculating their organizational carbon footprint. But you can also calculate the embodied carbon of products. Now, surprisingly, fitting those two together can be a big challenge because there are some big differences between operational carbon footprints and product carbon footprints. And the landscape is getting increasingly complex, as Adam said. So on this slide here, I've got some of the key standards, mechanisms, initiatives that are now quite prominent in the carbon measurement space. And you can see just how many different things there are that a company might be expected to adhere to. So new things come out every year, and it is becoming an increasingly complex landscape. Companies and suppliers are being asked to adhere to any of these methods, standards, frameworks that you see on this slide here. They each have different boundaries, different methods, different reporting frameworks, different tools. So fitting it all together is quite a challenge. Now, despite the challenges, it's also increasingly challenging for a company that manufactures thousands of products to portfolio carbon footprint all of those products. How can you do these carbon assessments to achieve the requirements of any of those standards or frameworks on the previous slide when you manufacture 12,000 products? So we've got some slides later on showing what ACO Water have done as a case study. Now, it really isn't fundamental to understand the challenges here to distinguish the difference between organizational type footprinting and product carbon footprinting. Now, for manufacturers and producers, the product carbon footprints or scope 3 emissions can be the largest part of your footprint, but not as many companies have been measuring the carbon footprint of their scope 3 or product carbon footprint emissions. Now, it's really important to understand the difference between organizational product footprints, and it's really important to understand life cycle thinking to understand the difference between those two. So if I start to go through life cycle thinking, we quite understand direct carbon emissions, but from a carbon footprint perspective of products, it uses life cycle thinking. So to give an example here of driving your car, if a car is rated for 120 grams of CO2 emissions per kilometre, that's the emissions coming direct out of the tailpipe. That's the emissions, the direct emissions, if you like. That's not the full life cycle emissions. And most companies, when they're doing their footprints, the scope 1 and 2, this is all that's been measured in addition to electricity. However, the true life cycle emissions that you need to account for when you're doing product footprints are much wider. So you have all these extra upstream activities, extracting the oil out of the ground, refining, transport, until you get the fuel into the fuel tank. When you factor all of those in, all of these activities, you might go from 120 kilograms of CO2, grams of CO2 per kilogram, to 150 kilograms of CO2 when you factor in all those upstream activities. When you factor in the embodied carbon of the car, you might be up to 180 kilograms of CO2 per kilometre. Now that shows you the difference between operational carbon footprints, potentially at the top at the 120 kilograms, and embodied carbon numbers down the bottom at 180 kilograms. So organisational carbon footprints are missing a lot of carbon that falls into scope 3 impacts, which is why companies are increasingly looking at what's their scope 3 emissions, what's their product carbon footprints. So also to look at the difference between them, this is a well-used diagram from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It shows what scope 1, 2 and 3 means. Now, most carbon footprints for operations fall in scope 1 and 2, and that's the minimum reporting requirement by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But you can see just the greater number of activities at the bottom there that fall into scope 3 emissions. Now, also to show for a manufacturing company like ACO, the difference between an organisational carbon footprint and a product carbon footprint is you could imagine different products being produced through the supply chain. An organisational carbon footprint cuts down your facilities that you own and operate, so all the energy and fuel for your manufacturing facilities. A product carbon footprint starts to look through the supply chain no matter where the activity happens. So all the materials that you buy in have an embodied carbon impact, and those have scope 3 emissions. Now, ACO have been doing both organisational footprints and product carbon footprints. We started working with them in 2015 on both of these. So in terms of organisational carbon footprints, to help with the annual measurement and also help to understand the data, a custom tool was developed around ACO Water's needs. Now, this ends up being a great way to help measure and benchmark and manage the carbon emissions. So a custom footprint tool was developed, which has been used since about 2015, and you can see that the significant reduction in carbon emissions achieved between 2015 and 2021 on the chart there. So the actual carbon intensity per tonne produced has been more than halved in that time period, and has gone even further in the last year as well. So that's on organisational footprints, and behind that you can see on some of Adam's slide the kind of effort and work that's been required to do that as well. Now, on product carbon footprints, the first assessment was done as a single study in about 2015-2016. That was done for the multi-drain and storm brick, so two key product ranges. And for a company, that's a great place to start, is do one product for a key product range that's selling. This will provide perspective, it will provide carbon hotspots, it will show you where the emissions sit in the manufacturing of that product, which sits through the supply chain. So often the impacts are outside of your own company's boundaries. Now, to help expand that and scale that and allow portfolio carbon footprints, the assessments move to more sophisticated, larger modelling of whole product ranges. So quite detailed, complex models have been produced to allow entire product ranges to be modelled at once. Now, these studies are done in adherence with standards. So EN 15804 is the standard that's often used for environmental product declarations. So they're high quality assessments that whilst these ones are not an EPD, you can do 1,000 products at once or the entire 12,000 one day. So also, to allow the use of these results, a custom tool was developed so that if a specific order comes along, you can put the quantities of materials in that order, and it gives you the embodied carbon results, which have been calculated in accordance with that standard there, for a specific order, a specific project, a specific job. So that allows reporting of specific projects, of this is the embodied carbon of all the products that have been procured for that particular project. The tool also auto-prints a PDF report so that the evidence of those EN 15804 calculations can be sent to clients or a project. So that's a really great way of engaging with customers who want the environmental data, they want to know it's to a high quality, such as EN 15804 standards, and they want to receive some evidence of what's the emissions of their footprint for their project. There's also work on engaging the supply chain and suppliers, ever increasingly looking for lower carbon materials, products, opportunities to reduce. Now, those opportunities are reaching further down the supply chain because your choice of materials that you buy in the products affects the product carbon footprint and the scope 3 emissions. So there's plenty of great work going on engaging through the supply chain as well. Now, in terms of some of the challenges to do this, some of the challenges are around the differences of an organizational carbon footprint and a product carbon footprint. Now, it's a great place to start is an organizational footprint if a company's not started on this journey. And ACO started on that already before we'd started working with them in 2015. But surprisingly, the carbon factors used for an organizational footprint are not the same as you use for a product carbon footprint because the boundaries are different. It's all those upstream emissions that organizational footprints are typically not reporting and adhering to. So there are differences in the carbon footprint factors and results for an organizational footprint as there are for embodied carbon footprints. They typically exclude what's known as well-to-tank emissions. That's all the energy to extract, transport, refine, get the fuel into the fuel tank or into wherever it's consumed in the first place. Those absolutely have to be included in a product carbon footprint or embodied carbon assessment. Now, also, perhaps surprisingly, many product carbon footprint assessments don't take a part share of companies' operations from offices or business travel from fleet. So that's another difference between the two assessments. They do have different boundaries, and fitting those together can present a little bit of a challenge, but it's all very achievable. Now, product carbon footprints can also offer good quality data for Scope 3 assessments, but again, Scope 3 goes even wider because you do a product carbon footprint for things you make and sell, whereas a Scope 3 emissions covers anything that you buy. It can include services, it includes stationery, it can include anything that your company spends money on. Now, the different standards and reporting frameworks, they are becoming a particular challenge because they often have different boundaries, methods. You've got CERC, you've got CBAM, which is just coming through, you've got EPDs, you've got different standards, and fitting them all together can present a bit of a challenge. But at their core, they still share the same needs of understanding data and information, bill of materials to do a product carbon footprint, and estimating the carbon emissions. So it's all very achievable. Now, in terms of a quick summary of the benefits of carbon footprinting, so interest in sustainability has definitely increased in the last few years, particularly carbon emissions and embodied carbon. And I myself, working full-time in this space for about 19 years now, have seen interest in embodied carbon just skyrocket since about when COVID hit. I'm not really sure what the link is or why, but interest in what we did has just went through the roof in a very short time space. So there has been a lot of interest in embodied carbon emissions. Measuring and reporting your carbon emissions is a great way to show that you care about climate change, and climate change is of course reported daily in the national press nowadays and becoming something that investors expect you to take action on. Now, it also, by doing your assessment, shows you where the carbon hotspots are within the supply chain. So a product footprint or a Scope 3 particularly shows you where the emissions sit. You might think that you have responsibility for the factories, the facilities, the buildings that you operate, and you do, but what if 90% of your emissions sat in the materials that you purchase and buy in? You should still tackle your own emissions, but perhaps you have bigger opportunities by looking at design, procurement, your Scope 3 emissions. So that can offer some really good reductions. So it helps focus the carbon reduction plans and develop realistic targets. You can't just switch a material for a product without looking at the design of the material, the price of the material, the availability, going through a feasibility to see what might be realistic to set as a embodied carbon kind of carbon reduction or Scope 3 carbon reductions. Finally, not quite finally, but you can help satisfy customer requests and requirements. So there are increasing requests in tenders for environmental data, and you can showcase your environmental achievements and enhance your brand's green credentials. And I think ACO have done a great job at showing the work that they've done and continue to do in this area. So that's a bit of a summary, and that's the final slide. So thank you.
Thank you. We're going to switch over to the other mics, and yeah, we've got a roaming mic going around, so if any of you got any questions for me or Craig, then please shoot away now. And thank you for listening, though. If you, I would thank you at the end in the last 5 minutes. If any of you got any questions? Not one? No? All right, well, thank you very much for your attendance. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. If you've got any questions at the end, you'd like to come up to us and approach us, we are very approachable. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming. It's really appreciated. Thank you for your time.